In the heart of a forgotten medieval village, where the air forever carried the scent of damp earth and burning wood, there stood a forge that never truly slept. At dawn, while mist still drifted lazily across the crooked thatched roofs and the crows perched silently upon the chapel steeple, the first sound to pierce the stillness was not the cry of a rooster, but the sharp, unending rhythm of hammer against steel. It was a sound so familiar that the villagers no longer noticed it. It had become part of the land's heartbeat, an echo of labor and survival that spoke of sweat, fire, and pain. Inside the dim workshop, where shadows trembled along soot-blackened walls, a man named Thomas stood before the anvil, his face half lit by the orange glow of the flames. He was the village blacksmith, a man as essential as he was invisible. His body bore the mark of his trade arms, thickened by years of swinging a hammer, skin cracked by heat and soot, eyes dulled by smoke and exhaustion. His hair, once a deep chestnut, had long been dusted by gray ash that no amount of washing could remove. He was not old by number of years, but the forge had aged him more cruelly than time ever could. The villagers relied on him for everything: plowshares, locks, nails, hinges, swords. But to Thomas, each creation felt less like a craft and more like a chain. The forge consumed him daily, body and soul, as surely as the fire devoured the logs he fed it. The work was endless. The rhythm of hammering was his prayer and his punishment. He would wake before the sun and collapse after midnight, yet still the anvil seemed hungry for more. The villagers paid him in coin when they could, in bread or ale when they couldn't, but payment was secondary to obligation. The smith's life was not one of choice, it was inheritance. His father had been a blacksmith before him, and his grandfather before that. The forge, they said, was the family's legacy. But to Thomas, it was a curse passed down through generations, binding him to the same suffocating glow of molten metal and choking smoke. His lungs rattled with every breath, each cough drawing up specks of black soot that never truly left him. His hearing had dulled to the world beyond the hammer's clang. He could barely recall the sound of birds or wind through trees. Even the faces of villagers blurred into one tired procession of demands. Fix this. Forge that, until all he saw were mouths moving, hands offering metal to be reborn in fire. Sometimes, when the heat grew unbearable and his vision swam from exhaustion, Thomas would rest his hands upon the edge of the anvil and stare into the coals. In the dancing light, strange shapes seemed to form faces, twisting in and out of the flame, eyes blinking open and then vanishing. He told himself it was fatigue, the trick of light, yet part of him wondered if the forge had grown a spirit of its own. After all, every blade, every nail, every chain that left his workshop had tasted blood, sweat, or suffering in some form. Soldiers came for swords that would one day kill. Farmers brought broken tools that kept them chained to fields that never yielded enough to eat. Even the monks who visited from the abbey carried iron crosses to ward off unseen evils. The forge had shaped instruments of survival and destruction alike. And over decades, Thomas felt that it had absorbed something from each, some faint echo of pain, a residue of the human will. He could feel it in the air, thick and watchful at times. The village children would sneak close to the workshop, peeking through the cracks in the wooden door. They laughed at the sparks that burst from the anvil like fireflies, daring each other to step closer. But when Thomas looked up, when his soot-streaked face turned toward them, their laughter died in their throats. His eyes were pale and hollow, reflecting the firelight in an almost inhuman way. And for a heartbeat, the children swore they saw the glow of the forge alive within him. They would run then, their small feet slapping against the mud, too frightened to tell their parents why the blacksmith's gaze made them shiver. Yet even they sensed what the adults had long forgotten, that the man who lived by fire was slowly becoming something forged by it. The nights were the worst. When the village drifted into uneasy sleep and the chapel bell fell silent, Thomas remained awake. The forge's fire never went out completely. It smoldered like an open wound, whispering in the darkness. He told himself he kept it burning so he could work at dawn, but sometimes he simply couldn't bring himself to let it die. The silence of a cold forge frightened him more than exhaustion ever could. One evening, as rain began to patter against the roof and the wind moaned through the eaves, he sat alone beside the fire, listening to its low hiss. The smell of wet earth mingled with the acrid tang of iron. The flames flared higher for no reason he could see. They cast strange, fluid shadows along the wall shapes that moved though nothing else did. Thomas leaned forward, squinting through the flickering light, and for an instant he thought he saw something impossible. Beneath the coals, deep within the molten heart of the forge, a face stared back at him. Its mouth opened soundlessly, then twisted into what might have been a smile. His heart lurched, the hammer slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. When he blinked, the face was gone. The fire roared again, as though laughing softly to itself. That night, he could not sleep. The rain continued long after midnight, whispering against the stones outside. Every few minutes, the forge would crackle with sudden heat. Though he had not touched it, he sat in the dark, wrapped in his soot-streaked cloak, and felt the weight of years pressing down upon him. The forge, his companion, his captor, seemed to breathe in the silence, its embers pulsing like a heartbeat. He tried to tell himself that he imagined it, that he was simply overtired, but the sound would not leave him. It was rhythmic, faint but steady, as if something alive was beating deep within the coals. Slowly, dread crept through him, not the fear of ghosts or demons, but something far heavier. What if the forge had learned from him, had drawn from his years of labor a fragment of his own soul? He thought of the faces he had seen, the whisper of his name that had haunted the edge of sleep for weeks. The forge did not simply consume wood and metal. It consumed him. When dawn came, the village awoke once more to the sound of the hammer. No one noticed that Thomas's movements were slower, his blows less certain. He worked mechanically, eyes distant, as if something else guided his hands. The forge hissed contentedly, brighter than before, its flames licking higher than they should. And though no one could have heard it over the ringing steel, there came from somewhere deep within that roaring fire a faint whisper that sounded eerily like a sigh of relief. The morning after the storm, the village stirred under a pale, colorless dawn, and the air carried the faint scent of smoke that never seemed to leave. Even the rain could not wash away the taste of iron that clung to everything near Thomas's forge. The square was slick with mud, the sky heavy and low. And yet the anvil sang again, steady and unbroken, its rhythm measured, as though the man who wielded the hammer no longer felt the strain of muscle or bone. The villagers passed by without much thought. Some nodded, some muttered greetings, but none lingered long. The forge frightened them now, though few would admit it aloud. They said it was the smoke that burned their eyes, or the strange way sparks flew too high, too bright. When Thomas struck the iron, children avoided the workshop altogether. Even the dogs gave it a wide berth, whining softly as they passed. Inside, Thomas worked with the same relentless precision, his movements almost mechanical, as if guided by an invisible rhythm older than the village itself. His hands were raw and blistered, his eyes sunken. Yet the fire within the forge burned as fiercely as ever, never dying even when the logs ran low. He had not slept since the night the fire whispered his name. He did not dare to. The whisper had changed since then. It came, now not from the flames, but from somewhere deeper, underneath the hammer's echo, faint and constant, murmuring in a tongue he could not understand. When he stopped to listen, it would fall silent, and when he turned away, it would resume, weaving itself into the hiss of metal meeting water, into the creak of the bellows. He began to wonder if it was the forge that spoke, or the sound of his own thoughts burning themselves hollow. Days blurred together. The world beyond the workshop seemed to fade. The marketplace chatter, the laughter of travelers, the tolling of the church bell. All that remained real was the glow of the coals, the ringing steel, and the quiet voice beneath the sound of work. By the third morning, Father Aldrich, the village priest, came to see him. Aldrich was an old man, pale and frail, yet his presence carried a kind of quiet authority that even the most hardened villagers respected. He stepped into the forge with a cautious reverence, clutching his wooden cross as though it might steady the air itself. "You've been working through the nights again, Thomas," he said softly, his eyes narrowing against the heat. "You'll burn yourself out." Thomas did not answer. He only lifted the hammer again, the muscles in his arms trembling but unyielding. The priest watched the iron glow beneath the blows, sparks scattering like fireflies around his robes. "Do you even sleep anymore?" Aldrich pressed, but his words seemed to drift. After a long silence, Thomas spoke, his voice hoarse and low, like the scrape of metal on stone. "It doesn't want me to." Aldrich frowned. Thomas paused, staring into the flames as though they might answer for him. "The forge," he murmured. "It remembers. Every blade, every nail, every drop of blood it's ever felt. It wants to make something now, something that doesn't break." The priest's expression shifted between pity and unease. He stepped closer, laying a hand on Thomas's shoulder, but the man flinched as if touched by fire. "You need rest, my son. The devil finds work for weary hands." Thomas almost smiled at that, but it was not a kind smile. "If the devil forged sin," he said, "he must have learned it here first." That night, Aldrich returned to the church, troubled. He told no one what he had seen, yet when he knelt to pray, his mind could not escape the image of the forge's roar, like the breath of some buried beast, its glow too fierce to be fed by mere wood. He prayed until his voice cracked, but the sound of hammering still echoed faintly in the distance, long after midnight. And inside that workshop, Thomas continued to work. His body had grown numb to pain. The burns on his hands no longer blistered, only blackened. The The walls of the forge dripped with soot and condensation, and strange shapes had begun to form in the shadows, patterns that looked almost like runes, carved not by hand but by smoke itself. The iron on his anvil that night was unlike anything he'd shaped before. It shimmered even before it met the flame, a dull, cold sheen that seemed to pulse faintly in the half-light. He didn't remember where he had gotten it, perhaps from a passing merchant, or perhaps he had simply found it one morning by the door, wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of salt and ash. When he placed it into the forge, the fire changed. It flared, not orange, but deep crimson, as though the coals had been soaked in blood. The voice rose again, louder this time, more insistent. It no longer whispered, sang, a low and rhythmic chant that seemed to come from the metal itself. Thomas's heart pounded, yet he could not stop. Each strike of the hammer echoed like thunder, and with every blow, the light from the forge pulsed brighter, flooding the workshop in a red glow that spilled through the cracks of the door and out into the village street. Those who lay awake that night would later say the light reached the church steeple, that the air itself shimmered with heat, though no one could smell smoke. Dogs howled, cows kicked in their stalls, and somewhere a newborn cried uncontrollably until dawn. None dared go to the forge. When the morning came, the fire had gone out at last. For the first time in years, the forge was cold. The door stood ajar. Inside, the air was thick with ash, the anvil cracked in two, and the walls blackened by soot that seemed almost oily to the touch. There was no sign of Thomas, only his apron, folded neatly upon the bench, and beside it, a single object resting where the anvil had been, a blade. It was unlike any the village had ever seen, blacker than night, smooth as glass, and humming faintly with a sound too soft to name. Father Aldrich was the first to find it. He stood in the doorway for a long time before entering, clutching his cross so tightly that his knuckles whitened. He picked up the blade, and for an instant, his reflection stared back at him, distorted eyes, hollow, mouth twisted into something between fear and wonder. He placed it down gently and backed away. When he later returned with others, the blade was gone. Some said thieves must have taken it. Others whispered that it had simply melted away. But those who passed near the forge after that claimed they could still hear the hammer, faint and distant, ringing from beneath the earth. And on nights when the air grew heavy and the village lay silent, the glow of unseen fire flickered faintly from the cracks in the ground, as though something beneath was still working, shaping, forging, waiting. 4 weeks after Thomas vanished, the forge stood silent, a black wound in the heart of the village, its roof sagging under the weight of rain and time, its once glorious fire reduced to gray dust that never seemed to cool. People avoided it during the day and locked their shutters at night, whispering prayers they barely believed in. The old priest, Father Aldrich, still passed by every morning, muttering blessings as he went, but his steps grew slower, his gaze unfocused, as though part of him was already being pulled toward the ruins. The anvil's remains lay cold and cracked, half buried in soot, yet sometimes, when the wind shifted, villagers claimed to hear faint tapping, slow, rhythmic, deliberate, the sound of a hammer from somewhere deep below the floor. At first, Aldrich dismissed it as superstition, the echo of imagination filling the silence Thomas had left behind. But each night, the sound grew clearer, sharper, more purposeful, like a craftsman working tirelessly in the earth's hollow chest. The villagers began to speak of the anvil below, saying Thomas's spirit was trapped there, forging in the dark for eternity. Children dared one another to touch the forge's door, though none ever made it that far. Those who tried said the air grew unbearably hot the closer they stepped, as though the ground itself breathed. When the first disappearance happened, no one made the connection. A shepherd boy named Aaron had wandered off one evening, his flock scattered along the riverbank. They found his staff days later near the forge, the wood warped and blackened at one end, the rest untouched. Then, a month later, a miller's apprentice vanished on his way home from the tavern, his footprints leading toward the forge before simply stopping in the mud. The priest's prayers turned to exorcisms, but the villagers began to leave. Fields grew wild, roofs collapsed, and soon the once bustling square fell silent, save for the occasional groan of wind against rotting beams, dot by winter's end. Only Father Aldrich remained. He kept to the church, thin and pale as parchment, his hands trembling as he lit candles no one came to see. He had stopped ringing the bell. The sound unsettled him now, for in the quiet that followed its toll, he thought he heard something answering from below. It began one evening while he knelt before the altar, whispering to God for strength he no longer felt. A deep vibration rolled through the floorboards, faint but unmistakable, followed by a sound that froze the air, the ringing of a hammer against metal, impossibly distant yet perfectly clear. He stumbled to the door, clutching his cross, and stepped into the square. The forge's roof was barely visible through the snow, but light flickered beneath its warped timbers, a dull, pulsating glow like breath behind ribs. The smell of burning iron drifted on the wind, mingled with something fouler, a scent of decay masked by heat. Aldrich hesitated only a moment before moving toward it, his boots crunching through frost, his breath rising in thin clouds. The closer he came, the heavier the air grew, pressing against his chest until each inhale felt like swallowing smoke. When he reached the doorway, he found the wood unburnt, yet warm to the touch, as if a furnace smoldered on the other side. The priest whispered a prayer and pushed the door open. Inside, the forge was alive again. The walls pulsed faintly, the air rippling like heat haze, and in the center, where the broken anvil had lain, a new one stood darker, smoother, its surface rippling faintly as though made not of metal but of something alive. Beside it lay Thomas's hammer. Aldrich approached slowly, crossing himself, his mind torn between dread and faith. He reached out a shaking hand and touched the anvil's edge. It was warm, then hot, then burning. Pain shot through his arm, but he couldn't pull away. The surface clung to him like molten wax, and before he could scream, the glow from within the forge flared white. He fell to his knees, clutching his hand, and through his tears he saw the truth, faces moving within the metal, hundreds of them, their eyes wide, mouths open in silent agony, their outlines twisting as if submerged in boiling glass. Among them, he thought he saw Thomas, staring back with a calm that made Aldrich's heart falter. The price, a voice whispered, not from the fire, not from the air, but from inside his skull. Every creation takes its due. Then came the sound of the hammer again, echoing from everywhere at once, and the priest fled into the snow. his robes catching sparks that hissed as they died upon the ground. He did not return to the church that night. By dawn, the villagers who had fled awoke to see smoke rising once more from the square, curling black against the morning sky. Some swore they heard the toll of the bell again, though no one had rung it in months. When they gathered the courage to investigate days later, they found the church door open and the altar bare. The candles had burned themselves down to wax puddles, and on the floor near the steps lay Aldrich's cross, warped and blackened at one end. The forge stood silent again, its fire extinguished, but something had changed. The air no longer smelled of ash, but of oil and iron, as if a new age of the forge had begun. And deep beneath the earth, where no light reached, the hammering continued, slow, deliberate, patient. The villagers never came back. The land grew wild, the square overrun with weeds and silence. Decades passed, and then centuries, until memory itself forgot the village's name. The forest swallowed its remains, and the forge sank deeper, becoming a myth, a ghost of fire beneath the roots of time. But sometimes, travelers passing through the valley would stop by the old stone well that marked what was once the village's heart. They'd say the ground there felt unnaturally warm, even in winter. Some claimed that when the moon was low and the wind was still, you could press your ear to the earth and hear it faint, rhythmic, eternal, the ringing of a blacksmith's hammer, echoing from somewhere far below, working tirelessly on the same piece of metal that Neve. The valley lay forgotten again, shrouded beneath moss and silence, as if the earth itself had swallowed its history to keep men from prying any deeper. But history, like metal, cannot remain buried forever, tarnishes, rusts, and one day forces itself back into the light. By the turn of the 20th century, when the railway lines stretched like veins across the British countryside, the valley found itself marked once more on a surveyor's map. It was supposed to be just another coordinate, another stretch of land to cut through in the name of progress. But fate has a way of guiding the curious toward places best left untouched. Among the team of engineers sent to chart the area was Arthur Leland, a man young enough to still believe in certainty and old enough to distrust legends. He saw the world through the lens of logic and geometry, dismissing old superstitions as relics of medieval ignorance. Yet when he and his men reached the valley, even his steady hand faltered. The place felt wrong, not cursed, not haunted, just awake. The soil was black and fine as ash. Their horses refused to descend the slope. The compass needles spun like clock hands, broken loose from time. And the air had a strange heaviness, as if the valley was breathing beneath them. Still, orders were orders. They set camp near what looked like the remnants of an old well. The stones around it cracked and blackened as though burned from within. That night, as the men shared their rations and smoked under a pale moon, a faint metallic sound drifted through the stillness. At first, it was mistaken for the wind brushing tin, but the rhythm was unmistakable, steady, deliberate, like hammer on iron. Some laughed it off, others grew quiet. Arthur wrote in his log that the sound seemed to rise from the ground itself, measured, patient, ancient. He tried to locate its source, but found only the faintest warmth when he pressed his palm to the soil. The warmth pulsed. He didn't sleep that night. By dawn, he had convinced himself it was a trick of nerves or temperature gradients. But when they began to dig, his doubts returned. The soil was strange, compact, metallic, and beneath the top layer they found lumps of slag, the waste of old forging. Then, on the third day, the shovels struck something solid. They uncovered it carefully, a slab of blackened stone, resting over something that gleamed beneath. It wasn't rock, it was iron, but iron that looked impossibly fresh, smooth as glass, and cold as winter. As they brushed away the last of the dirt, they saw an object embedded in the earth, an anvil, still upright, still perfect. The men stepped back in silence, unsure whether they'd unearthed a tool or a tombstone. Arthur, entranced, reached to touch it. It felt alive, pulsing faintly, vibrating with an internal rhythm, as if the heart of the valley beat through it. He swore he could hear something beneath it, a low humming, deep as thunder, yet strangely human. That night, it rained. The campfire burned blue instead of orange. The air smelled of hot iron and something like blood, and when the lightning flashed, the shadows around the anvil seemed to move on their own. The men wanted to leave. Arthur refused. He believed he had found the remnants of a forgotten civilization, a forge so advanced it defied time. He set up instruments, took sketches, and marked the coordinates carefully. But his notes grew stranger each day. One entry reads, "It knows we've found it." Another, "The metal whispers in my sleep. It remembers hands." On the fifth night, a storm rolled in from the west, howling through the trees like a choir of unseen voices. The wind tore through the tents. The rain turned the soil to black sludge, and the air itself shimmered with heat despite the cold. Then came the sound hammer against anvil, clear and close. The men froze. The strikes grew louder, faster, until they felt it in their chests. One by one, their lanterns went out. Arthur ran toward the pit, shouting for the others to follow. But when lightning split the sky, he saw something he could never describe. The anvil glowed red, and behind it stood a silhouette, tall, broad, indistinct, holding a hammer that swung in perfect rhythm. It turned toward him, faceless yet watching. The next flash of lightning revealed nothing but smoke and rain. When the storm passed at dawn, the valley was quiet again. The anvil still stood, wet and gleaming, steam curling from its surface. The men were gone. All that remained were blackened footprints circling the pit and Arthur's journal lying open on the ground. The final line was scrawled across the page, uneven and smeared. "The forge is not dead. It sleeps beneath us and dreams of hands." No one ever found the bodies. The railway project was quietly abandoned. Locals fenced off the land, claiming the soil was cursed. Yet, on windless nights, travelers still report hearing it, the faint metallic ringing from somewhere deep below, steady and patient as the heartbeat of the earth. When word of the vanished engineers reached the nearest station, no one dared return for weeks. The authorities dismissed it as an accident, flooding, perhaps, or a landslide, but none could explain why the ground there still steamed when the rains stopped, or why the iron tools left behind had fused into the rock like candle wax. For years, the valley was marked unsuitable for construction, and nature reclaimed what men had scarred. Moss crept over the rusted rails, and trees swallowed the survey stakes. The world moved on, but the forge beneath the soil continued its slow, patient breathing. In 1939, the valley stirred again. War had come, and with it, the hunger for resources. A secret division of engineers under the Ministry of Supply began combing through old records in search of new metal sources. They found Arthur Leland's coordinates buried in a forgotten filing entry, noting unusual magnetic interference and iron deposits of high purity. To the bureaucrats, it sounded promising. To those who knew the folklore of the region, it was an invitation to disaster. In October of that year, under the gray light of war, a convoy of trucks rolled into the valley. Soldiers, scientists, and technicians erected tents where Leland's camp had once burned. They brought drilling equipment, generators, and floodlights that cut through the mist like white knives. For the first few days, the work went smoothly. The machines operated with precision, though their readings made no sense. Compasses spun wildly, dials twitched, and instruments registered heat where there should have been frost. On the fourth night, a technician named Miles Garvey was the first to hear the metallic rhythm faint beneath the generator's hum, a sound he described later in his notes as like the ticking of a colossal heart made of iron. He thought it was resonance from the machinery, until he shut the engines down and the sound continued. That was when he realized it came from underground. The next morning, the drilling team reached something hard. The bits screeched and shattered as sparks burst from the earth. When they cleared the debris, they uncovered a slab of smooth black metal, no rust, no markings, yet the surface shimmered faintly like liquid held still. They called it the core. The scientists argued over its origin. Some said it was meteorite iron, others some unknown alloy. But one of them, Dr. Ives, wrote a single line in his notebook before disappearing. This metal is remembering itself. That night, the floodlights flickered and died. The valley plunged into darkness. Men scrambled for lanterns, shouting orders. But the only answer was the ringing hammer strikes, slow and deliberate, echoing from deep within the earth. Panic spread as shadows moved between the tents, though no one could see what cast them. The sound grew louder, closer, until the ground itself shook with each impact. Then came the light, dim, reddish, seeping through the cracks in the soil. Some said it was fire. Others, something older, the glow of the forge itself. Miles Garvey tried to flee, but tripped near the excavation pit, and as he looked down, he saw eyes staring back from below, two embers burning in the dark, reflecting the shape of his own terrified face. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thunder of metal. When the dawn came, the storm had passed, and silence returned. The camp was empty. The drills were melted into slag. The ground fused into black glass. A single recording device survived, though it was warped beyond repair. When analysts later managed to recover fragments of the tape, all they heard was a rhythmic pulse, 3 strikes, a pause, 3 strikes, again repeating endlessly. The project was immediately classified and buried beneath layers of bureaucratic denial. The war offered plenty of distractions, and soon no one cared to ask what had become of the team in the valley. But some of those who had listened to the recovered tape reported hearing the sound long after they left the room, echoing faintly in the walls, following them home decades later. In the early 1970s, the valley had become a myth whispered among locals. They called it the Field of Echoes, where metal hums and men vanish. A filmmaker named Harlan Keats, obsessed with forgotten places, decided to document the site for a television special on British hauntings and folklore. He brought a small crew, skeptical and curious, armed with cameras and tape recorders. What they found was nothing but stillness. No birds, no wind, only the heavy quiet of abandoned land. Harlan described it as a silence that waits. The ground was warm beneath their boots. Near sunset, one of the crew spotted something glinting among the roots, a chunk of smooth, black iron, half the size of a skull. When they lifted it, the air trembled. Their equipment began to fail. Film, jammed microphones hissed with static, batteries drained in seconds. But the tape kept rolling, and what it captured was unmistakable, faint hammering, rhythmic and constant. None of them heard it until playback later that night. In the footage, Harlan's voice trembled as he whispered, "It's still working." The crew never finished their documentary. Authorities claimed they'd been lost in a landslide, though the valley shows no sign of one. The reels, recovered years later, were locked away. Those who viewed them reported sleeplessness, recurring dreams of a man at a forge with no face, striking sparks that never died. And some swore that in the faint reflection on the film's surface, the hammer paused mid-swing, as though aware of being watched. By the time the century turned, the valley had sealed itself again, hidden behind fences and warnings no one heeded. But sometimes, on nights when storms roll through the moors, flashes of blue lightning reveal the outline of an old forged door buried in the hillside, glowing faintly from within. Locals say if you listen close, you can still hear the anvil ringing, slow, steady, patient. It is said the metal beneath the earth dreams not of being found, but of being used again. And one day, when another curious hand dares to touch it, the fire will return, and the iron will remember the shape of those who forged it first. By the end of the 20th century, the world had changed in every way except the ones that mattered most. Steel still sang, cities still burned, and men still dug too deep for the things they thought they could control. The valley, long forgotten by maps and governments, became a blank spot that whispered to a new generation, one that mistook the past's warnings for superstition. In 1997, a corporation named Helix Industries, known for experimental metallurgy, acquired land in the northern counties for underground testing. Among the parcels was a restricted zone labeled only Site 9F. The files were incomplete, the history buried under decades of war-era secrecy. When Helix's survey team arrived, they found the valley eerily untouched. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves, only a thin fog coiling across the black soil. Their instruments failed within hours. Compasses spun, GPS devices flickered, and every piece of steel seemed to hum faintly when held near the ground. Still, the project advanced. The director, Dr. Eleanor Stroud, was a metallurgist with a reputation for brilliance and obsession. She'd spent her career studying alloys that resisted decay and heat. The idea of a place where metal refused to rust fascinated her. She dismissed local tales of vanished workers and cursed ground as provincial fear. "There's no such thing as haunted iron," she said. But when her team began drilling, the machines seized up after just 30 feet, their bits screeching as though biting into something alive. They adjusted their equipment, applied more pressure, and then came the sound, a deep, resonant clang that made the ground tremble. At first, they thought it was the machinery vibrating, but when they cut power, the ringing continued. The valley exhaled heat, the air shimmering with invisible waves, And in that moment, even Dr. Stroud felt something shift beneath her feet. The soil pulsed once, like a living thing. That night, the team's floodlights flickered and died, one by one, until only the moon's thin glow remained. Somewhere in the distance, through the mist, came the soft rhythm of metal striking stone. The next morning, their sensors registered temperatures inconsistent with surface readings over 400 degrees below ground. Stroud was ecstatic. She believed they'd discovered a geothermal anomaly. They widened the borehole, lowering cameras into the depths. The feed showed layers of obsidian-like rock fused together as though molten, and then something else, metallic surfaces forming geometric patterns that no natural formation could explain. Before the feed cut out, one frame captured what appeared to be a circular chamber with a single anvil-shaped mass at its center, glowing faintly red. Stroud replayed the footage until the screen burned dim. "It's artificial," she whispered. "Someone built this." The crew, unnerved by the pulsing vibrations beneath them, begged to halt the dig. But Stroud ordered the drills restarted. "If there's a structure down there," she said, "it's ours now." By dusk, the ground began to quake again, dust swirling in rhythmic bursts, matching the metallic heartbeat the valley had carried for centuries. And then, for the first time in living memory, the valley spoke. A low, grinding voice echoed up through the borehole, not made of words, but of sound metal against metal, groaning like an old machine awakening from a long sleep. The noise grew louder until the earth split open with a crack that shook the hills. Flames black, not redirected from the fissure, swirling in slow motion, consuming nothing, yet burning everything with their presence. Cameras melted, lenses burst. The heat was unbearable, though the air remained cold. The workers fled, but Stroud stood motionless at the edge, transfixed. The fire did not flicker like flamet, flowed, deliberate, almost sentient. Within it, faint shapes formed, arms, hammers, faces made of glowing steel. For a moment, she saw a forge stretching endlessly below, with thousands of phantom figures striking in perfect unison, their hammer blows like thunder under the skin of the world. And then the fissure closed, the valley went silent, and Dr. Stroud was gone when rescue teams arrived days later. They found the site perfectly intact, equipment, tents undamaged, but there was no sign of the scientists. The hole had sealed itself with a smooth crust of metal, fused solid, as if it had never been drilled. The only trace of Stroud was a recording device discovered near the collapsed rig. Its final minutes were filled with the rhythmic sound of hammering, faint and distant, growing faster until it became almost human breath. At the very end, a single whisper bled through the static, a woman's voice repeating softly, "It's awake." Helix Industries denied the project's existence, erasing every document, but rumors leaked from those who'd heard the tape. Some said the company melted it down with the other evidence. Yet others claimed the metal refused to liquefy, no matter the heat applied. In the years that followed, the valley was fenced off once again, marked as a contamination site. But there are still nights when travelers along the highway report seeing light through the fog flashes of black fire, illuminating the hills for a heartbeat before vanishing. And always, after the light fades, comes that same distant sound, hammer against iron, slow, patient, eternal. Weeks passed, and the official reports quietly buried the Helix incident under the label of thermal anomaly and personnel misplacement. But rumors have a way of surviving where truth dies. Truckers on night runs spoke of strange lights drifting above the valley, like embers moving against the wind. A retired firefighter from the nearby town of Stonemere told anyone who'd listen that the air around Site 9F tasted like rust. Even the animals had learned to avoid the place. No birds crossed its boundaries, and no roots dared to grow near its soil. Beneath all that silence, something had changed deep under the crust. Those who lived within 10 miles began to report a low hum at night, faint but steady, like a machine idling beneath their floors. The frequency was almost hypnotic, lulling some into uneasy sleep and driving others into madness. Local legends revived again, old tales about the blacksmith who forged the devil's chain, whispered in taverns that hadn't seen outsiders in decades. One story claimed that every few centuries, the earth reopened its furnace to reclaim the souls of those who'd once worked its metal. Another, more unsettling, said the fire was no curse but an invitation, a call to the craft. In early spring of the following year, a freelance journalist named Daniel Harker began investigating the Helix disappearance. He wasn't the kind of man who believed in curses. His world was one of deadlines and camera lenses, not ghosts. Yet, he was drawn to the stories, missing pieces, the lost footage, the unmarked graves, the heat signatures that satellites still picked up months after the explosion. Harker's first night in the valley was uneventful. The air was still, the silence total. But when he played back his audio recorder, the silence was filled with faint rhythmic clanging, as though someone were hammering deep beneath the soil. He thought it might be mechanical feedback until he realized the rhythm was too human. That night, he dreamed of fireless furnaces and molten rivers flowing like veins under a skin of stone. The next day, he returned to the same coordinates where Stroud's team had vanished. There, he found a patch of ground darker than the rest, smooth as glass and faintly warm to the touch. His compass spun. The recording equipment glitched. It's magnetic interference, he muttered to himself. But he couldn't explain the sudden pressure in the air, that feeling of being watched by something vast and unseen. Then came the whisper, not through the wind, but through the earth itself, vibrating up his spine like a living current. "Do you hear it?" it asked, though no one was there that night. His footage captured what he didn't see, a faint glow rippling under the ground like liquid fire, each pulse synchronized with a metallic beat, and for a moment, the soil itself seemed translucent, revealing, far below, a sprawling network of black tunnels and shifting orange veins of molten light. He packed up in a hurry, but when he reached his truck, he found the steel frame burning hot as if exposed to a furnace. His keys, once silver, were blackened. The battery was dead. The engine refused to turn. Panic set in as he realized he wasn't alone. Out in the fog, he saw a figure walking toward him, tall, thin, wearing a welder's mask, its outline flickering with red light beneath the surface of its skin. The figure didn't move like a person. It glided, deliberate, with a heavy grace, each step leaving behind a faint scorch mark on the earth. Harker stumbled backward, fumbling for his flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. He grabbed his camera, clicked the shutter, and the flash illuminated the thing for just a second. A man made entirely of metal, its surface scarred and pitted as though forged and reforged 1,000 times, a faint heat shimmering from its core. Behind its visor there was no face, only a hollow darkness glowing faintly red. When the light faded, the figure was gone. Harker ran, but as he did, he felt something burning against his chest. His pendant, a small silver cross, had turned completely black. He managed to hike back to Stonemere by dawn, delirious and dehydrated. Locals found him collapsed by the roadside, whispering nonsense about fire and hammers and faces beneath the ground. His camera, when recovered, contained only a single intact image, the silhouette of the metal figure standing against a background of glowing fog. The file metadata showed the timestamp 3:33 a.m., a number that would become significant later when power surges across the region began to occur at exactly that minute each night. Harker never spoke publicly about what he saw again. Within months, he disappeared entirely. But his recordings, later leaked anonymously, contained fragments of something extraordinary. Voices whispering through the static, repeating words in an archaic dialect no linguist could identify. Some believed it was Latin. Others said it was older than language itself. When analyzed spectrally, the audio revealed a secondary frequency, a hidden pulse that mimicked the resonance of molten metal cooling under pressure. The analysts joked that it sounded like the Earth's forge cooling down, but it didn't cool. The readings showed it was getting stronger. Years later, the land around Site 9F remains fenced and guarded by an unknown agency. There are no official records, no government acknowledgments. Yet, satellite heat maps show something growing beneath the surface. Concentric rings of rising temperature, expanding outward like ripples. Some say it's geological. Others swear it's alive. Locals know better. On windless nights, they still hear the faint clang of unseen hammers and smell burnt metal drifting through the mist. And when the fog glows faintly orange before dawn, they lock their doors and wait, listening, because they know the black fire is patient. It sleeps, but it never dies. In the decades that followed the disappearance of Daniel Harker, the valley became less a place and more a scar on the world's memory, a wound sealed but never healed. Maps still marked the area as restricted geological zone, yet roads around it seemed to warp subtly, pulling travelers away like iron filings bending around an unseen magnet. Most forgot the name Helix, but old workers from the company spoke of it in half-whispers over drinks they never finished. They said the valley had never cooled. It had only learned to breathe quietly. The black fire had sunk deeper, hiding beneath the earth's veins, waiting for a call that would come again in its own time. That call arrived in 2014 in the form of an archaeological grant from the University of Brackenford, where a historian named Professor Lydia Crane proposed a study tracing medieval forge sites across northern Europe. She'd spent years collecting fragments of myth that seemed to describe the same recurring phenomenon, a living flame beneath iron soil. The Helix site, buried in obscure industrial records, fit her criteria too perfectly to ignore. Against warnings from colleagues, she secured permission to excavate near the valley's edge. To her, it wasn't a curse. It was history trying to speak. And Lydia Crane had always been the kind of scholar who listened too closely when she first arrived. She was struck not by the silence, but by the rhythm of it, the faint throb beneath her boots, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. Her students joked about the forge gods snoring, but she took notes on every vibration. Her instruments recorded minor tremors every few minutes, perfectly consistent, perfectly timed, like the ticking of an enormous clock. "If this is natural," she said in her field log, "then nature is keeping time." The excavation began with shallow trenches and soil cores. But by the third week, they uncovered something no one expected: layers of fused iron, overlapping like scales, buried meters deep. Each layer seemed burned from the inside out, the heat marks radiating upward instead of downward. It was as if the metal had grown from the earth itself. Beneath these layers, they found fragments of what looked like ancient tools: tongs, hammers, chisels, all blackened but not rusted. The steel still held its shape after centuries. When one of the students, a young man named Ellis, touched the handle of a half-melted hammer, he jerked his hand away in pain. "It's hot," he said, astonished. The temperature gun read 22 degrees Celsius, but his palm blistered as if he'd grabbed red coals. Lydia marked the artifact item for 7A and sealed it in a lead-lined crate. That night, Ellis couldn't sleep. He said he heard hammering in his dreams, not chaotic, but methodical, like something building piece by piece inside his head. By the 5th week, every compass and camera began to fail. Batteries drained within minutes. The nights grew unnaturally warm, though the valley's air remained cold and still. One evening, when Lydia reviewed the day's notes, she realized something impossible. The rhythmic tremors they'd been recording had changed tempo, subtly matching the beats of their own digging. "It's responding," she whispered. Ellis laughed nervously, but her face remained grave. Later, when the team retired to their tents, Lydia wandered alone toward the excavation pit. The moon hung low, veiled in a haze of ash. Down in the pit, the exposed metal faintly glowed, not orange or red, but deep black, the color of heat too intense for light to escape. She stood over it, notebook in hand, and felt her heart sinking with the slow pulse beneath her. For a moment, she thought she heard breathing, the earth inhaling, the ground exhaling, and with every breath came the faintest clang, echoing up through the soil. She whispered into the dark, "Who are you?" And the valley answered with silence, followed by a low vibration that made her knees buckle. She dropped her pen, and when she reached for it, she noticed something new. The soil beneath her was no longer just warm, it was moving, as though liquid metal stirred just beneath the crust. The next morning, the team awoke to find the excavation pit completely sealed. The fused iron had risen overnight, smoothing over the trench as if nothing had ever been dug. Their equipment was intact, but rearranged into a perfect circle around the site. Lydia stood staring at it for a long time, then simply said, "It doesn't want to be uncovered." That afternoon, a helicopter from the university's funding board arrived with orders to withdraw. They cited environmental instability, though Lydia knew it was something else. "Someone doesn't want this story told," she said. As they packed their crates, she noticed that item 47A, the blackened hammer, was missing. Ellis swore he'd sealed it himself. They searched for hours, but it was gone. That night, as the team camped near the highway, Ellis woke screaming. His tent glowed faintly red from within, the air filled with the smell of burning iron. When they unzipped it, they found him kneeling over the missing hammer, clutching it with both hands, his eyes unfocused. His palms bled where the metal had fused into his skin. "It's calling," he kept whispering. "It remembers." He was sedated and airlifted out by morning, though his pulse continued to beat in the same strange rhythm. Lydia had recorded in the valley. The project was shut down immediately. Lydia was placed under administrative review, accused of falsifying data and damaging university property. But she never stopped hearing the rhythm, in the hum of streetlights, in the throb of passing trains, in her own heartbeat. She recorded the pattern night after night, convinced that the forge beneath the valley wasn't just alive, it was spreading. When she played her recordings back, she noticed something chilling, faint voices whispering behind the vibration. One of them, she swore, was Dr. Eleanor Stroud. The last line in Lydia's journal, written days before she vanished, read simply, "The anvil has awakened again. It knows our names." After Lydia Crane vanished, the university sealed her office, confiscated her notes, and scrubbed her name from the faculty registry as if she had never existed. But some things refuse erasure. Months later, the janitorial staff began reporting a strange phenomenon. The radiator in her old office, disconnected and dry, still radiated warmth. The desk drawers occasionally rattled on their own, and once, when a graduate assistant entered to archive remaining files, he swore he heard a faint tapping beneath the floorboards, a rhythm so precise it could have been Morse code. He left the building and never returned. By winter, a small number of her students had begun exchanging her old recordings online. They claimed the vibrations hidden in her tapes, those rhythmic pulses of metal and breath, had measurable effects on nearby machinery. Hard drives corrupted, phones overheated, even pacemakers reportedly skipped in sync with the beat. On one forum, a user uploaded a slowed version of the sound at half speed, calling it the Blacksmiths' lullaby. It spread across dark archives of the internet, traded like contraband, often deleted as quickly as it appeared. Those who listened to long reported vivid hallucinations, dreams of endless forges, cities of iron, and hands made of molten glass reaching upward through the dark. Some began to sketch what they saw: great anvil-shaped monuments, rivers of black fire, symbols etched in spirals, and, without knowing it, they drew the exact sigils carved into the valley's buried metal plates. Somewhere beneath all that myth and madness, something was listening back. By 2016, strange patterns began surfacing across Europe. Sensors in old mining towns registered heat surges in identical intervals, always the same rhythm, always at night, always precisely 3 minutes and 33 seconds apart. In an abandoned steel mill in Manchester, the floor plates began to tremble in time with those pulses, the sound echoing like a heartbeat in the pipes. Workers nearby described the sensation as a hammering from under the world. At first, authorities blamed underground gas lines or tremors, but the pattern spread too predictably to be natural. Seismologists called it a harmonic anomaly, while others whispered that it was Lydia's rhythm continuing without her. And then came the footage. A security camera inside a sealed smelting chamber captured a moment that defied explanation. Without any power connected, the furnace door began to glow faintly red, metal bending inward as if something behind it were breathing. No flames, no pressure, yet the steel warped like wax. The feed ended abruptly when the lens cracked from the heat. But not before a final frame revealed something reflected on the metal's surfacer, faint outline of a human face, expressionless, eyes hollow, staring outward. The date stamp read 3:33 a.m. Meanwhile, those who had worked under Lydia began to disappear. One by one, students and technicians connected to her excavation left their homes without explanation. A bus driver claimed to have seen a young woman walking barefoot along the northern road toward the restricted valley, her clothes blackened with soot, her hands bandaged. When police searched the area, they found only footprints scorched into the gravel, perfectly round impressions, as if made by molten metal cooling on contact. The case reports were quietly dismissed, but there were whispers that the valley's forge had begun reclaiming its followers. Then, late one night, a maintenance crew inspecting the power grid near the Brackenford campus reported the strangest blackout in the city's history. Every street light dimmed at once, leaving the streets bathed in deep red glow, as though illuminated from beneath. Witnesses described hearing a chorus of faint hammer strikes echoing from underground tunnels, dozens at first, then hundreds, each one in perfect rhythm. When the power returned, every metal surface within a mile radius bore the same scorch pattern, a ringed spiral, identical to the markings from the valley's excavation site. Scientists tried to explain it as electrical discharge, but no one could account for the molten residue left behind. It wasn't copper, iron, or any known alloy. The story might have faded again, if not for the footage uploaded 3 months later to an anonymous channel titled The Ash Forge Archive. The video, shaky and grainy, appeared to show the interior of an underground chamber. Walls slick with condensed vapor, floor covered in black ash. In the center stood a single anvil glowing faintly with orange veins, pulsing like a living organ. A woman's voice, trembling but calm, narrated off-screen, "It's no longer asleep. The breath is back. The anvil is thinking." The timestamp, again. Read 3:33 a.m. Analysts traced the voice and concluded based on vocal tone, cadence, and inflection that it was a match for Lydia Crane. But that was impossible. She had been missing for nearly 2 years. Whether the footage was real or a fabrication remains unsolved. But those who've studied the original frames say there's one detail that cannot be dismissed at the very end. Before the feed collapses into static, a hand made entirely of liquid metal reaches across the lens. The reflection of its palm reveals dozens of faces, silent, glowing red from within. Since that night, small tremors have continued to ripple beneath the northern counties. Always faint, always rhythmic, like the forge breathing beneath the skin of the world. Power engineers still speak in quiet voices about heat spikes that melt underground cables for no discernible reason. Seismologists dismiss them as random noise, though one, when pressed, admitted that the pattern matches a human pulse, 60 beats per minute, slowing only when the temperature rises. It's as if something vast and mechanical beneath the earth is learning to rest, waiting for its next command. The locals near the valley call it the anvil's dream. They say that someday soon, when the pulse finally aligns with our own, the black fire will surface again, not to destroy, but to forge. What it will forge, none can say. But if you ever find yourself driving along that northern highway just before dawn, roll down your window and listen closely. If you hear the faint ringing of distant hammers, do not stop. Do not look back, because those who listen long enough always hear the same whisper through the steel. The forge remembers its makers. The first time the bell rang in Brackenford, no one was alive to ring it. The old university tower had stood silent for decades, its bronze tongue cracked, its frame choked with ivy and dust. Yet, on the morning of October 31st, 2017, at exactly 3:33 a.m., the sound rolled through the sleeping town like thunder pulled from the bones of the earth. It wasn't the clean chime of bronze or brass. It was deeper, hollow, metallic, in a way that scraped against the nerves rather than the ears. Windows rattled, dogs howled. The few who woke described the sound as a heartbeat inside metal. No one claimed responsibility. The maintenance crew found the bell untouched, the rope unmoved, and yet the stone beneath the tower's foundation was warm to the touch, leaving faint circular scorch marks spiraling outward. Within days, strange phenomena began spreading through Brackenford's campus. Iron door handles warping overnight, nails slipping from wooden beams as though rejecting the material, and thin streams of black soot forming patterns along the wall's spirals that mirrored those seen in the valley's fused metal. Students laughed it off as urban legend until the humming began. Every night, just before 3:33, the air itself seemed to vibrate, a low tremor that hummed through the glass panes and echoed faintly in the chest. The sound was almost musical, like a faraway forge hammering in perfect time. Some students began recording it, posting videos online. The clips all cut off abruptly, with distorted audio and faint whispering beneath the static, though no two videos captured the same words. At first, university officials dismissed the events as hoaxes, but within weeks, the engineering department's magnetometers began malfunctioning, and one by one, the campus's steel fixtures, door hinges, railings, lamp posts developed fine hairline fractures, as though fatigued by invisible stress. When the physics faculty conducted a field resonance test, they discovered a repeating frequency of 19 Hz vibrating through the ground, strongest beneath the old bell tower. "It's not tectonic," one researcher noted in a leaked memo. "It's harmonic." They traced the anomaly deeper and deeper until their instruments failed, the readings collapsing into incoherent numbers. The next night, during a student gathering, the bell tolled again 3 times each strike, accompanied by a blinding flash of red light beneath the tower's base. Those who stood closest swore they saw a faint silhouette appear inside the bell, a woman's shape, suspended upside down, her hair hanging like liquid metal. When the light faded, the image was gone, and in its place was a scorched handprint embedded in the bronze surface of the bell. No one dared touch it, but those who came close said they could feel warmth radiating from it, pulsing faintly in rhythm with their own heartbeats. The university sealed the tower the next day, posting guards around the site, though the guards themselves didn't last long. Each of them reported the same dream, the sound of hammering echoing down a long corridor, growing louder until it became a bell's toll, followed by a whisper that said, "Wake the forge." None of them stayed past a week. Rumors began to spread that the bell itself had been recast from scrap metal retrieved from the northern valley, the same iron that refused to rust, the same alloy Lydia Crane had unearthed before she vanished. If that was true, then the bell was never just a symbol of academia. It was a relic, a fragment of something older, something designed not to call students to lecture, but to summon what slept beneath the ground. The town's older residents began reporting power outages and strange light flickers at 3:33 every night. The glow wasn't from the tower, but from beneath it, seeping up through the cracks in the cobblestone. Local radio frequencies filled with static at the same time, carrying faint patterns of coded beeps that analysts later described as rhythmic. Morse pulses repeating the sequence, STROUD. Dr. Eleanor Stroud. Her name carried through static years after her disappearance. When the recordings were slowed and filtered, they revealed something even more disturbing, a second layer of sound beneath the static, the tolling of a distant bell, echoing as if through metal corridors. Then came the night of the blackout. On November 9th, Brackenford lost all power for exactly 6 minutes and 66 seconds. During that impossible gap, witnesses described the sky above the bell tower glowing crimson, not with light, but with heat, as though the air itself was smoldering. Some claimed to see faces in the glow indistinct, metallic, their mouths moving in silent rhythm. When power returned, the bell was gone, not destroyed, not melted gone. The tower stood hollow, the air thick with soot, and on the stone floor beneath, where the bell had hung for centuries, was a single blackened anvil, perfectly smooth and still radiating faint warmth. The university cordoned off the site permanently, though that didn't stop the stories. Travelers passing through Brackenford still report hearing the bell on windless nights, even though there is nothing left to ring it. The sound is said to come from underground now, deeper and farther away each time, as though the earth itself were swallowing the tone, forging it into something new. To this day, no one knows where the bell went or what became of those who first heard its hollow chime. But some believe the town itself was reforged that night, its stones and metal saturated with the rhythm of the ancient forge beneath. They say if you walk through Brackenford's old campus at exactly 3:33 a.m., every sound, the wind, the leaves, your footsteps will sync perfectly to that same slow, eternal beat. And if you listen long enough, you'll hear what the students of 2017 heard before the blackout, the faint echo of hammer against iron, echoing not from the tower above, but from deep, deep below, where something vast and molten dreams of being awakened once more. After the bell's disappearance, Brackenford fell into an uneasy quiet, but silence never lasts long in a place that has heard the voice of metal. The university's administration locked away all research related to the tower, erasing any mention of Dr. Stroud or Lydia Crane from their archives. But whispers always find cracks to crawl through. Students began noticing faint metallic hums in their recordings lectures, interviews, even simple phone calls, and when these files were slowed down, the same resonance appeared again, a perfect harmonic vibration at 19 hertz, the same as before. Those who investigated found that this frequency wasn't confined to the tower anymore. It pulsed through the ground beneath the entire town, an inaudible rhythm you could feel more than hear, vibrating faintly in bones and glass and dreams. The few who stayed long enough began to show strange symptoms: nosebleeds that left metallic stains, eyes reflecting light like old copper, and, most unsettling of all, a growing sensitivity to sound. One art student, Miranda Cole, claimed she could hear the breathing of the earth if she pressed her ear to the ground near the tower. She was found 2 nights later, collapsed near the sealed foundation, her skin streaked with soot, her pupils dilated entirely black. On the stone beside her were faint scorch lines, forming a pattern like concentric circles, or according to those who studied the photos, like ripples in molten metal frozen mid. She survived, but when she awoke, she refused to speak. She only tapped her fingers against her blanket, slow and rhythmic, as if keeping time to something only she could hear. The surviving researchers from the earlier investigation were recalled quietly, though one, Dr. Victor Lane, went public. He released fragments of his notes online before vanishing. In them, he described the bell not as an artifact, but as a resonant key, one piece of a larger structure buried beneath the valley, something built before recorded history, using metals not found in modern alloys. He theorized that the ringing of the bell had awakened a harmonic memory in the material beneath Brackenford, causing it to react like a tuning fork connected to an ancient machine. His last message ended with a single cryptic sentence: "The forge is no myth, it's an engine, and it's listening." Within a week, his apartment was found empty. His clothes were folded neatly on the bed, his laptop screen cracked, and his fingernails torn at the edges as though he had been clawing something metallic before disappearing. In the hallway outside his door, neighbors reported the faint smell of burnt iron and a single low hum that faded the moment they spoke about it. By winter, Brackenford had become a ghost town in everything but name. The students left, the faculty transferred, even the street lamps refused to stay lit after midnight. The few who remained began to speak of dreams that felt more like transmissions, visions of blacksmiths in faceless masks, hammering at invisible shapes in endless tunnels, their hammers striking in rhythm with the bell's old chime. Those who shared these dreams reported waking up with burns on their hands, as if they had touched hot metal. The dreams grew stronger the closer one slept to the tower. A team of paranormal researchers who visited in early December claimed to have captured infrared footage of the ground itself shifting in tiny pulses, like a lung inhaling beneath the surface. They also recorded an electromagnetic anomaly so strong it interfered with pacemakers and phone batteries. The footage, uploaded briefly before deletion, showed a flicker of something impossible in immense circular chamber, glimpsed beneath the tower through ground-penetrating radar, shaped not like a bell, but like an inverted one, a hollow descending cone of metal and stone, filled with faint heat signatures that moved, pulsing slowly in synchronization. When the researchers returned a week later to continue their study, the chamber readings were gone as though whatever they had detected had sunk deeper. Then came the storm. On December 13th, thunder without lightning rolled through Brackenford, followed by freezing rain that coated the entire valley in a metallic sheen. The rain wasn't ordinary, it left behind tiny fragments of iron dust that clung to windows and skin like glittering soot. Power failed again at 3:33 a.m. This time, the ground shook not violently, but steadily, like the world was adjusting itself beneath the town. Witnesses described hearing not a bell, but a low, continuous drone, deep and mechanical, that grew so loud it blurred into silence. The sound carried miles beyond the valley, recorded faintly by seismographs across the region. When morning came, the anvil that had replaced the bell was gone. In its place lay a perfectly circular depression, as though something immense and heavy had risen through the floor, leaving behind nothing but the imprint of its weight. Around the depression, the stone was fused, glass-like and black. Those who examined it said the surface was etched with the same sigil found on the valley's metal fragments, the spiral intersected by lines like spokes in a wheel. Only now, there was a new symbol added within the spiral, a small circle at its center, marked with a faint metallic smear that looked disturbingly like a fingerprint. The government sealed off Brackenford soon after, citing industrial contamination, but people still find ways in. Urban explorers, thrill seekers, and amateur documentarians sneak through the fences at night. Most of them come back with corrupted footage, but a few bring something else, the sound. Microphones pick up faint, rhythmic hammering. That begins exactly when the clock strikes 3:33. One recording, online as the Hollow Bell EVP, contains 6 minutes of what sounds like mechanical forging. At the very end, a voice, faint and distant, can be heard whispering a single word before the recording cuts to static. Below, no one has ever verified its authenticity, but those who listen through headphones report an unnerving side effect, the sensation of heat blooming inside their ears, like standing too close to an open furnace. Afterward, some claim they can still hear the sound faintly for days, echoing in silence, pulsing through walls, or in the hum of power lines today. Brackenford remains off limits, swallowed slowly by the moors. The university tower stands like a burnt tooth on the horizon, its clock forever frozen at 3:33. Locals say the hum is still there, traveling underground like a buried heartbeat. Some nights, if the fog is thick enough, the reflection of the tower appears doubled, one in the mist above ground, and one beneath, glowing faintly red as if submerged in molten metal. Historians have since drawn connections between the events in and similar phenomena reported in mining towns across Europe and North America, places where the earth once yielded strange metals that sang when struck, metals that seemed to resist corrosion, metals that resonated when buried deep. These were dismissed as superstition, but the pattern is undeniable. Every site lies on the same geological fault line, one that forms a ring stretching across continents. They call it the Boreal Circle, and if you trace it carefully, Brackenford sits at its very heart, the place where the first bell was cast, and perhaps where the first note was ever struck. Those who study the bell's history whisper one final theory, one that is never written down. The bell was not calling something to the surface. It was calling the surface back to something, a summoning not of sky or spirit, but of memoria, forge remembering the shape it once held before the earth cooled and stone covered its flame. They say that when the bell tolled its last note, the world itself rang in answer, and deep beneath Brackenford, the old furnace stirred once more, dreaming in metal. It waits, humming faintly beneath the soil, until another resonance calls it to Wakand. When it does, the first sound humanity will hear will not be a scream or a song, but a single perfect chime echoing from the hollow of the earth, reminding us that what we built from the bones of the planet was never truly ours to keep. When the last records of Brackenford were erased and the valley sealed under government order, the land above it began to change in ways the cartographers could not explain. Fields that had once lain fallow swelled in uneven ridges, as though the ground itself had been hammered from below. And the farmers in the nearby hamlets spoke of their plows striking not stone, but something that rang faintly, a buried plate of metal that shifted with the seasons. None of them stayed long. The air was wrong, they're thick and sweet, like iron left too long in rain, and the livestock would shy away from the soil, their hooves clicking nervously on unseen hardness. By the late spring of the following year, only one man remained to work the land: Elias Harrow, a tenant farmer whose family had owned the surrounding acres for generations. He was not a superstitious man, or at least that was what he told himself when he heard the strange vibration rising through his boots as he tilled the fields at dusk. He had heard the stories. Of course, every villager had, but he refused to let ghost tales chase him from the only inheritance left after a lifetime of debt and drought. He worked from dawn until the fog crept over the hills, the sound of his hoe and the distant crows the only things keeping him company. Yet even as he dug, he noticed how the soil seemed alive, small tremors beneath the furrows, a pulse that answered his heartbeat, and sometimes a faint hiss like cooling metal sighing just below his reach. The first true sign came one night in June when a storm rolled in without thunder or wind. The clouds hung heavy and motionless, turning the horizon the color of burnt copper. Elias watched from his doorway as a dim orange glow pulsed across the far meadow. Not fire exactly, but something smoldering beneath the soil. He took his lantern and went to look, boots sinking into mud that steamed in the rain. In the center of the field, he found a hole no wider than a coin, glowing faintly red. When he leaned closer, the light pulsed once, and the earth around it gave a low, hollow clang, like a struck bell. Startled, he stumbled back, but curiosity outweighed fear. He fetched his shovel and began to dig. The deeper he went, the stronger the warmth grew until the metal edge of his shovel bent slightly, softening as if the ground itself radiated heat. After an hour, he uncovered a curved surfacer, vast plate of blackened steel, inscribed with patterns so old they looked almost natural, like veins in rock. As he brushed away the mud, the surface shimmered faintly, and for an instant he saw his reflection in it, not his weathered face, but a figure standing behind him, wrapped in shadow, its eyes burning with dull orange light. He turned, but nothing was there, only the rain and the endless field. When he looked back, the reflection was gone, and the glow within the plate dimmed to nothing. He filled the hole and went home in silence, though the hum beneath the soil followed him, resonating softly in the walls of his farmhouse until dawn. For weeks afterward, Elias tried to ignore it. He told himself it was gas, or underground water, or the memory of the wind. But the nights grew restless, his dreams filled with the sound of hammers, slow, deliberate, striking in rhythm with his heart batand. When he awoke, the room would shake ever so slightly, the lantern swinging though there was no wind. On the seventh night, he awoke to the smell of smoke and iron. In the darkness, he could see a faint red light bleeding through the cracks of his floorboards. He followed it outside, and saw that the field was glowing again, the same pulse spreading outward like ripples from an unseen forge. Drawn as if by compulsion, he walked barefoot into the center of the glow, the soil warm and trembling under his feet. He fell to his knees and pressed his palm to the ground. The hum became a voice, not yet, but the raw vibration of something immense, stirring beneath the crust, ancient and patient. It filled his bones with sound, vibrating through his teeth, his eyes, his blood, until he thought he might break apart from the resonance. When it stopped, the silence was so deep it roared. The next morning, the field was cold and gray again, but in the exact spot where he had knelt, the soil had fused into glass. Word spread quickly through the nearby villages, though no one dared to come close. The government inspectors, who arrived weeks later, recorded nothing unusual beyond magnetic fluctuations and unexplained subsidence. They sealed the area and left warning signs that no one heeded. Elias, now alone in his isolation, began to write. His notebooks later, found half-burned near the fireplace, describe what he called the foundry beneath the fields. He wrote of feeling its pulse align with the cycles of the moon, of hearing faint clangs at the same moment each night, and of seeing distant flickers of red light moving under the soil like veins of fire. He spoke of dreams in which he saw a vast subterranean hall filled with silent figures, blacksmiths with no faces, each hammering in perfect rhythm, forging shapes that melted as soon as they cooled. At the center of that hall stood a colossal bell, inverted and half-buried, its interior glowing like a furnace. From its rim hung chains of molten metal that reached upward, connecting to the roots of the world. He could feel them tremble whenever he awoke. The last page of his journal ends mid-sentence. It is not making metal, it is making. And the rest is lost to Ashdod. When neighbors finally came looking for him that autumn, they found the farmhouse deserted, the ground outside cracked and sunken as though something beneath had inhaled. His tools were still laid out beside the field, their handles scorched but unburned. Inside the house, every mirror and window pane had melted into warped shapes, as if softened by heat, yet nothing else showed signs of fire. And though the air was cool, the floorboards still hummed faintly underfoot. In the cellar, they found a small patch of soil glowing faintly through the cracks, a perfect circle, the color of dull iron. When one of the inspectors touched it, he claimed to hear a distant toll, so low it was more a vibration than a sound. They covered the hole with concrete and left. The land was abandoned once more, fenced and forgotten, another silent scar on the map. But travelers passing the valley still speak of strange lights beneath the crops on moonless nights, and some swear they can hear the rhythmic clang of hammers rising faintly from under the fields, keeping time with something old and alive that has never stopped working since the world was young. The night after the field sank, the valley lay silent beneath a sickle moon, and though the air was cool, a faint heat rose from the earth like the breath of something slumbering just below the roots. The fences that once marked the borders of Elias Harrow's land had begun to warp, the wood bending inward toward the center of the fields, as if drawn by some invisible gravity. And in the neighboring hamlets, the villagers whispered that the soil there had become magnetic, that nails, tools, even horseshoes would drift slowly toward it if left overnight. They avoided the place now, crossing themselves when they saw the faint red shimmer that still pulsed beneath the furrows. But for every soul that stayed away, there was another who felt drawn toward it, compelled by dreams that did not feel like their own. One such dreamer was a man named Reverend Calder, a scholar of theology who had once taught at the Brackenford Seminary before its closure. He had lost his faith not through doubt, but through silence, the kind that followed unanswered prayers, and when he heard of Elias's field, he took it as a test, or perhaps a calling. He arrived one fog-heavy morning, a frail man in a black coat, carrying nothing but a Bible and a worn brass compass that spun wildly the closer he drew to the valley. The farmhouse was gone now, collapsed into itself, but the ground around it was strangely smooth. The soil melted into glassy ridges that reflected the sky in fractured patterns. Calder felt the hum immediately, a low vibration rising through the soles of his boots, steady and deep like a heartbeat. He tried to pray, but the words faltered in his throat. Instead, he knelt and pressed his palm against the earth, whispering for understanding. The soil was warmed to warm, and as he knelt there, he felt a faint answering pulse, slow and deliberate, like a breath responding to his own. For an instant, he thought he heard a voice not speaking, but shaping itself out of the vibration, a resonance so low it bypassed hearing entirely and trembled instead within his bones. He could not discern the words, but he understood the intent. Something below was aware of him, and it was listening. Calder spent 3 nights camped beside the field, documenting every sound, every tremor, every flicker of light beneath the soil. His notes, later found in the vestry of an abandoned chapel miles away, described the phenomenon not as evil, but as ancient, something neither divine nor infernal, but mechanical in a way that transcended human design. He wrote of seeing the air shimmer like heat haze, of hearing what he called the hammer's rhythm echoing faintly between the hours of 2 and 3 each morning, always in sequences of 12. On the final night, he recorded that the sound had changed, no longer came from below, but from all around, resonating in the fog, in the wind, in his own heartbeat. He wrote, "It is forging not matter, but memory." His last entry ends abruptly with a smudge of ink and a single phrase scrawled sideways in the margin. "It remembers the bell." He was never seen again. Weeks later, a group of geologists surveying the valley for structural instability reported anomalies that defied explanation. Their instruments registered faint electromagnetic pulses at rhythmic intervals. And beneath the surface, sonar mapping revealed voids, massive caverns stretching for miles, shaped not like natural caves but as though carved by intention, each lined with what appeared to be metallic latticework. The readings suggested that these structures moved, flexing slightly, expanding and contracting in slow intervals, breathing like some dormant organism. The geologists abandoned their study after their lead technician, a man named Hanrahan, collapsed during a seismic scan, claiming he could hear chanting in the static. His recordings, though distorted, capture faint metallic echoes that, when amplified, resembled the tolling of distant bells submerged underwater. Analysis of the audio revealed harmonic frequencies identical to those once documented at Brackenford Tower. Whatever lay beneath the field, it was not new. It was connected, part of the same vast subterranean network that had slept for centuries, its pulse now spreading outward like ripples through stone and time, by autumn. The valley was declared unsafe and cordoned off, yet the hum did not stop. It deepened. Travelers passing on the nearby road reported strange phenomena: mirrors fogging despite the cold, watches stopping precisely at 3:33, and headlights dimming as if light itself were being absorbed. Some swore they saw faint figures in the fog, silhouettes of men striking invisible anvils, their hammers moving in perfect silence. Others heard the distant toll of a bell when the wind shifted east, though there were no churches left standing within 10 miles. Farmers, as far as the coast, began finding streaks of blackened iron embedded in their soil. The fragments warm to the touch and etched with markings that matched those of the Brackenford relics. The pattern of their appearance formed a spreading circle centered precisely on Elias Harrow's field, as though something beneath were expanding outward, testing the limits of its confinement. The government sent one final team, a classified operation tasked with sealing the anomaly once and for all. They arrived under cover of night, transporting heavy machinery and drilling equipment, their floodlights cutting through the fog. What happened next is pieced together only from fragments of recovered footage. At 2:46 a.m., the drills struck something beneath the soil that was not rock but metal immense, curved, and resonant. The moment of contact triggered a vibration so powerful it overloaded their instruments and blacked out the recording. When the feed returned minutes later, the floodlights flickered and the air shimmered like liquid glass. The team's audio captured a sound not unlike a choir, but deeper, as if the earth itself were singing through their bones. The final frame shows the ground opening not violently, but smoothly, folding inward like molten waxen. Then the feed ends. At dawn, the field was empty. The vehicles, the machines, the men all gone. Only the faint outline of a perfect circle remained, glassy and black, reflecting the color of the sky today. The valley is nothing more than a scar on the map, erased from satellite images and omitted from surveys. But the locals know. They say the nights there are never truly dark, that the mist glows faintly red from below. And if you stand long enough in the silence, you can feel the hum beneath your feet, steady and patient, as though the world itself were dreaming of its own creation. Some travelers claim that on cold mornings, when frost covers the ground, patterns appear in the ice, concentric circles crossed by lines like spokes, the same sigil carved into the Brackenford bell. And if you listen closely, they say, just before the first light of dawn, you can hear it, the faint echo of hammer on anvil, the rhythm of the foundry beneath the fields, still working in the dark, shaping something vast and unknown from the memory of the earth. By the time the frost returned to the valley, the land above the foundry had been erased from every living record, its coordinates deleted, its soil listed. Yet the hum beneath the earth did not fade. It grew slower, deeper, more patient, as though the world itself were drawing breath before a long exhalation. Far to the north, in the old industrial district of Leeds, a retired metallurgist named Helena Ward began receiving shipments. She had never ordered crates filled with black iron fragments, each stamped with an unfamiliar sigil that matched nothing in any known catalog. The delivery slips bore no company name, only a date that had not yet come to pass. Helena, whose hands still bore the scars of the foundry floor from her youth, should have dismissed them, but something in the metal spoke to her. When she placed one fragment beneath her microscope, the lens fogged from within, and the glass trembled faintly, humming at a frequency she felt in her teeth. She wrote in her notebook that the structure of the alloy was implacably lattice shifted between crystalline and amorphous forms, as though undecided what it wanted to be. She stayed awake for nights, listening to the hum until it began to synchronize with the ticking of her wall clock, each second stretching longer than the last. On the seventh night, when the minute hand reached 3:33, the clock stopped, and the fragment on her table began to glow with a dull, inward light, not illumination, but something more like awareness. Helena said aloud, without thinking, "What do you want?" And for a moment the room seemed to breathe. The air thickened, the temperature dropped, and the iron whispered, not in words, but in resonance. When it stopped, her furnace downstairs roared to life of its own accord, the coal igniting with no spark. Neighbors later told police they saw smoke pouring from her chimney and heard the clang of metal at impossible speed, as though a dozen smiths worked within the walls. By morning, the smoke had turned pale blue, and the sound ceased. The workshop door was locked from the inside. When authorities forced it open, they found the furnace cold and empty, its interior lined with glassy residue. Helena was gone, but her notebook lay open on the bench, its last line written in a shaking hand. It wants to remember its shape. The investigators dismissed it as delirium, though one constable noted that the steel girders supporting the roof had begun to bow inward, subtly warped toward the center of the room. Samples of the residue were sent for analysis, but never reached the lab. The courier's van vanished on a clear morning outside Sheffield, leaving only tire tracks that ended in the middle of the road, as if erased. Weeks later, reports emerged from scattered towns along the moorland railway, strange tremors at night, a metallic smell rising from drains, and whispers of light beneath the soil, like distant furnaces flaring. Miners in the old tunnels swore they heard hammering echo through the stone, rhythmic and slow, though every shaft had been sealed for decades. One described seeing molten metal seeping through cracks in the wall, glowing veins that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. When he touched it, the glow spread under his skin before fading, leaving his veins faintly luminous for days. Doctors called it a chemical burn. He called it communion. Across the region, compasses began to fail. Clocks stalled at the same moment, 3:33, and dogs refused to cross. Railway tracks that ran parallel to the old freight line used once to transport iron from Brackenford. Something beneath was moving, following the path of forgotten industry, crawling north beneath foundations and rivers like a migrating memory. In early November, a series of power outages struck the entire county. Witnesses described a low, resonant tone preceding each blackout, lasting exactly 12 seconds. The tone, recorded on emergency dispatch tapes, matched, down to the hertz, the frequency once detected in Blacksmith Tower. Engineers tracing the outages found their epicenter beneath an abandoned foundry outside Wakefield 1 that had been closed since the 1920s after a boiler explosion killed 40 men. When a team entered the site, they found no evidence of trespass. Yet the floor was warm to the touch and the air thick with the scent of scorched iron. In the center of the main hall lay a depression filled with slag that pulsed faintly like cooling lava. Embedded within were dozens of tools hammers, tongs, chisels melted together into a single fused sculpture that still vibrated softly. The vibration increased when approached and ceased when touched, as if responding to presence. One researcher recorded the sound and slowed it down by a factor of 10. What emerged was unmistakable. 12 slow strikes of a bell, followed by a single exhale, like the hiss of quenching metal. The file corrupted moments later, leaving behind only static, shaped in waveform like concentric circles. That winter, snow refused to settle over the northern moors. The ground steamed faintly, and beneath the thawed ridges, travelers saw glimpses of black sheen just under the surface. Locals claimed the moor itself had become hollow, that when you stamped your boot, the echo lingered too long, as though you were walking over a vast, empty chamber. One shepherd found his flock dead in a perfect ring, their wool singed but unburned, their eyes reflecting a red glow, though no light shone nearby. When he returned with help, the bodies were gone, leaving only circular scorch marks that faded within hours. Geologists blamed methane, priests blamed sin. No one dared to dig. The hum persisted. Radios caught fragments of it between stations, low notes rising in 12-beat intervals, sometimes forming words that sounded half human, half machine. Those who listened to long reported dreams of furnaces without walls and hammers without hands, sparks falling like rain in endless darkness. By the turn of the year, the phenomenon reached the coast. Fishermen pulling in their nets found them coated in metallic dust that shimmered crimson under moonlight. The harbormaster described the water itself as breathing, expanding and contracting with the hum, rippling without wind. Beneath the pier, divers discovered structures in the sand resembling the ribs of colossal machinery, each beam etched with the same sigil found in the Brackenford relics. The metal was warm despite the freezing water. Samples brought to the surface cooled instantly and turned brittle, collapsing into ash. It was as if the metal could not exist apart from whatever force lived beneath it. Soon the hum returned to the land, louder now, as though the sea itself had joined the chorus, only that it appeared overnight on a farm outside Whitby, narrow crack stretching for 100 meters, glowing faintly from within. The soil around it had fused to glass, and when wind passed over the gap, it produced a sound like the blowing of an enormous horn. Scientists sealed the area, but the sound continued beneath their feet. Some claimed the tone carried information, that it was not random, but language frequencies arranged, like the syllables of a word older than speech. A final report filed before the area was quarantined suggested that the signal matched seismic data along the boreal circle itself, indicating simultaneous vibrations across thousands of miles. The foundry beneath the fields had awakened not in isolation, but in unison, its pulse spreading through the bones of the earth like blood through veins. And so the world waits, though most do not know it. The hum is everywhere now, hiding in the background of power lines, in the static of phones, in the rhythm of trains. It is easy to dismiss, yet every 3:33 a.m., clocks hesitate, lights flicker, and somewhere beneath our feet, a single hammer falls, marking time for a furnace that never went out. Those who wake at that hour sometimes smell smoke, faint and metallic, and feel warmth rising through the floorboards. They say if you listen long enough, you will hear it breathe, and if you answer, if you whisper back, it will remember you. shaping your echo into its design, folding your story into the endless forge of the world. When the last embers of the Whitby fissure cooled, the world above them seemed to exhale in relief. Yet beneath that fragile calm, the forge continued to stir. In cities miles away, strange phenomena began to appear in the most ordinary of places: factory floors, railway depots, and even the basements of houses built over old industrial lines. Metal objects would vibrate faintly when left alone. Iron fences hummed in windless nights, and old church bells chimed without motion, their tongues still, their voices hollow. Those who heard them often woke the next morning with the taste of ash on their tongues and faint burns along their palms, as though they had handled something hot in their dreams. Scholars tried to attribute it to hysteria, an echo of the collective unease that always follows disaster. But certain historians began to dig through the records of the first foundries built in the north, searching for mention of the sigil now etched into every new manifestation. In the archives of Manchester, they uncovered letters from the late 18th century written by a craftsman named Tobias Hartwell, describing an iron that remembers flame, a substance found in a collapsed mine that would reheat itself when struck. Hartwell wrote of his attempts to forge it into tools, of how it sang as the hammer fell, a sound that made his apprentices bleed from the ears. The letters ended abruptly, but the final page bore the same mark found in Brackenford: a circle, divided by 12 lines, surrounding an open hand. The historians dismissed it as coincidence until they noticed the wax seals on the envelopes were made not of wax, but a black, glass-like residue still warm to the touch after 2 centuries sealed. The government's involvement deepened then, quietly beneath headlines about economic recovery and power grids. Specialized teams were dispatched to survey abandoned mines, their reports classified under environmental safety. One of those teams, operating near the Pennines, went silent for 31 hours. When contact was re-established, the lead engineer spoke in fragmented phrases, describing tunnels grown from within, metallic roots twisting out of stone. He said they had found heat signatures that moved like living things, pulsing in groups of 12, and that, when their sensors went offline, they heard something breathing behind the walls. The transmission ended with a sharp metallic ringing and a whisper, "It's building." No further communication came. The official report claimed a gas leak, but satellite imagery revealed faint rings of discolored soil radiating from the site, perfect circles that grew larger every week. At their center stood a mound of slag that seemed to rise higher each night, as though being forged upward from below. In time, ordinary people began to vanish. Workers in steel mills would clock in for the night shift and never clock out, their time cards stamped at 3:33 a.m. with no trace of their bodies. In one case, a camera captured a man standing before his furnace moments before disappearance. The footage showed him gazing into the molten pit, then leaning closer as though hearing something beneath the roar. His lips moved. Then the frame flickered and the furnace went cold. When the camera resumed, he was gone, and the surface of the metal had hardened into a smooth black mirror. The plant manager who viewed the footage described seeing his own reflection in that mirror, except the reflection was smiling while he was not. Within days, he too vanished. Rumors spread of foundries where the fires never went out. even after being flooded, of workshops that relit themselves on nights when the wind turned east. A few who escaped such places spoke of hearing rhythmic blows echoing underground 12 at a time by silence so absolute it made their hearts falter. The last to document the phenomenon was an anthropologist named Simon Kells, who believed the sigil represented not a god, but an equation 12 divisions of heat, each corresponding to a phase of transformation between matter and memory. He theorized that the foundries of the industrial age had unknowingly acted as conduits, forging not just metal but something sentient within it, an intelligence born of repetition, pressure, and flame. His journals, found in a derelict train car near the coast, described his final expedition to what he called the primary vent, a sinkhole that had opened in an abandoned blast furnace complex near Darlington. Kells wrote that as he descended, the air grew warmer and the sound became rhythmic, like breathing slowed to ritual tempo. He claimed to see movement beneath the slag, shapes like coiled tendons of iron shifting beneath a translucent crust. His final entry read, "It is not sleeping. It is waiting for the hammer that ends the 12th. The camera recovered, with his body contained only one image, a blurred frame of light spiraling upward like molten thread forming a cage." The lens itself had melted. After Kells' death, the government sealed every foundry north of the Humber. Freight routes were diverted, power substations relocated, and entire villages quietly resettled under pretexts of contamination. Yet, even as the industry disappeared from the surface, new sounds arose beneath. Homeowners reported faint vibrations at 3:33 each morning. Tools left in drawers shifting by inches overnight, and distant clangs echoing through radiators. A woman in Halifax claimed her heating pipes whispered her name. Another awoke to find her iron bed frame glowing faintly red, though it was cold to touch. When investigators removed it, they discovered symbols etched into the underside of each Bartwelve lines, one for every hour between dusk and dawn. The furnace was spreading, not as fire, but as resonance, rewriting the memory of metal itself. No one can pinpoint when the first lights appeared in the sky, but they followed the same rhythm, 12 slow flashes, then darkness. The lights formed rings over decommissioned steel towns, their color not quite natural, a shade between red and gold that seared after images into the eye. In the silence that followed, people reported hearing the faint toll of a bell, its note descending rather than rising, as though struck deep underground. Seismographs across Europe began recording consistent pulses from the Earth's crust, all perfectly synchronized, all occurring precisely at 3:33 a.m. local time, regardless of time zone. The phenomenon became known among scientists as the iron pulse, though most dared not study it closely. Those who did often developed a condition they called resonance sicknessa gradual, alignment of their heartbeat to the frequency of the hum. Victims reported warmth spreading through their chest, a metallic taste, and an irresistible pull to descend into dark, enclosed spaces. Many were found dead near construction sites or subway tunnels, their hands blackened and fused into nearby rails. The pattern on their skin matched the sigil exactly. Then, one February morning, the ground itself spoke. Across the north, a sound rolled through the valleys like distant thunder, but clearer, as if shaped by human hands, a sequence of 12 strikes, each one slower than the last, followed by a single breath of wind that smelled of molten ore. It left behind silence that felt conscious, waiting. All around the world, iron began to move. Bridges shuddered, pipes groaned, and the great bells of cathedrals trembled on their mounts. For 12 nights, the hum did not fade. Those who remained awake through it claimed to hear something beneath the resonance, a voice speaking through vibration rather than words, saying, "The furnace remembers." And then, on the 13th night, it stopped. The air cooled. Machines slept. Clocks resumed. But the earth did not forget. Beneath the old foundries, in chambers of slag and memory, the molten forms continued to stir, patient and blind. They would wait for the hammer again, as they always had, until the 12th strike fell and the world exhaled once more. In the dim hours before dawn, when the air hung thick with the cold residue of night and every window pane trembled with invisible current, the last of the old blacksmiths died in his sleep. His hands curled around a hammer whose head had been worn smooth as bone. They buried him near the ruins of the foundry where he had worked 50 years ago, the ground still faintly warm, even in winter. And when the coffin was lowered, a dull tone reverberated from the soil, deep enough to stir dust from the mourners' coats. No one spoke of it. Yet that same night, across towns and coastlines, clocks halted again at 3:33, as if some vast, unseen mechanism had paused the world to take measure. The air carried the scent of hot iron, though no forge burned. Pipes groaned in empty factories, as though the dead were still at work. A journalist named Clara Muir, who had been following the sealed foundry stories for months, woke to the sound of tapping in her apartment wall. 12 soft knocks, evenly spaced, then silence. When she pressed her ear to the plaster, she swore she heard breathing behind it, slow and rhythmic, as if the building itself were alive. Her investigation led her north to the restricted zone near the Peninsula, where she found villages abandoned without record, doors chained, and roads cut short by earthen mounds that hummed faintly underfoot. The locals who remained spoke in low voices about the hammer, a presence that moved unseen through the earth, marking each 12th hour with a blow no man could hear with his ears, but only feel in his bones. Clara recorded their stories, the static between her tapes laced with metallic echoes. In one fragment, a child's voice whispered, "It's not making weapons, it's making a memory." She played that clip only once before it erased itself. When Clara reached the heart of the restricted zone, she found the ruins of an estate once owned by an industrial magnate named Osric Vela, man who had vanished in 1912, along with his entire workforce. Beneath his manor stretched tunnels leading to a private forge complex, sealed after his disappearance. The stone entrance was scorched, as though by a fire that had burned from within. Clara, drawn by the faint hum echoing through the ground, forced the rusted door open and descended with only a lantern. The stairs spiraled deep into the earth, walls sweating with condensation that smelled faintly metallic. At the bottom, she found a vast chamber lined with blackened machinery, bellows, anvils, and crucibles frozen in time. Yet the floor pulsed faintly under her boots, as though the stone itself had veins. She wrote in her notes that every surface vibrated with a rhythm too slow to hear, but impossible not to feel. a pulse that aligned with her heartbeat until the two were indistinguishable. The deeper she ventured, the louder the resonance became, not as sound, but as presence, pressing against her skin. In the center of the chamber stood a massive hammer, suspended above an anvil by iron chains, both fused together by rust that shimmered faintly red when her lantern passed. The walls bore hundreds of handprints, some small, some impossibly large. Clara approached the hammer, and for a moment the air seemed to stretch. The chains trembled, and she felt heat radiate from the metal. Then she heard the strike knot in her ears, but in her skull a single blow that froze her breath and made the lantern flicker out. In the darkness, she saw shapes forming from the shadows, outlines of figures laboring wordlessly, their hammers falling in perfect unison. When she fled back to the surface, her recorder was gone, but her notebook remained. Its last line read, "The 12th hammer waits to fall." Days later, tremors shook the region. Geological instruments recorded pulses identical to those detected during the first foundry events, but stronger, more deliberate. Each registered exactly 12 per night, followed by silence. In cities miles away, steel bridges began to hum again, faintly at first, then loud enough to make the air vibrate. Windows resonated, nails twisted in their frames, and church bells shivered on their hooks. Electrical systems failed whenever the 12th pulse passed, as if the energy of the world was being measured, weighed, or tested. Across news networks, footage surfaced of skyscrapers subtly swaying in unison, their foundations resonating with invisible force. A pattern analyst studying the oscillations noted that the frequency followed a sequence corresponding to the pattern of hammer strikes used in ancient ritual forges. 12 beats, pause, repeat, rhythm, once believed to summon the breath of metal. When he published his findings, his body was found slumped over his desk. His hands fused to his keyboard. The metal melted into his skin. The official cause, electrical accident. The unofficial truth, the hum had learned to answer. By midwinter, the resonance spread beyond machines. People began hearing the pulse in their dreams, 12 echoes deep beneath consciousness, each accompanied by flashes of red light and the image of a hammer falling through endless smoke. Some awoke to find soot on their sheets. Others bore burn marks shaped like rings. Those who tried to ignore it grew restless, their sleep shortened, their thoughts filled with metallic whispers urging them to forge or finish. A psychiatrist in York recorded one patient muttering in an unknown language, words that matched phonetic transcriptions from Tobias Hartwell's centuries-old letters. Another patient, a miner's widow, claimed she could feel the ground breathing beneath her home. "It's not earth anymore," she told him. "It's cooling metal." Soon after, her cottage collapsed into a sinkhole that glowed red from within. Rescue teams found only her rosary, each bead fused into a perfect sphere of slag. As the world's attention turned to economic turmoil and winter storms, no one noticed the slow dimming of the northern horizon. Satellites captured images of faint red fissures stretching across miles of moorland like veins beneath skin. Observers described them as auroras trapped in the soil. When scientists attempted to drill near the largest fissure, their equipment melted. Readings indicated temperatures that should have vaporized rock, yet the surface remained cool. The hum returned stronger than ever, its frequency spreading through metal, water, even bone. Those sensitive to infrasound felt nausea, disorientation, and visions of enormous forges suspended in darkness, hammers striking unseen anvils with the weight of mountains. Governments ceased their investigations. Religion returned. Churches filled again. Though their bells no longer rang, they hummed. The final event came quietly. At exactly 3:33 on the winter solstice, every clock on Earth stopped. Lights flickered once and went dark. For 12 seconds, the world held its breath, and from the depths came the sound, not thunder, not machinery, but the final blow of a hammer, slow and absolute, resonating through ocean and stone. In that instant, every piece of iron on Earth, every nail, bridge, coin, and rail vibrated as one. Those awake described seeing their reflections shimmer as though the metal remembered them. Then silence fell, total and complete, the kind that makes one aware of their heartbeat. When the power returned, the fissures were gone, sealed as if they had never existed. But in certain corners of the world, when night deepens and clocks approach 3:33, people claim to hear a faint, rhythmic sound rising from below, the echo of the 12th hammer, counting time for something that is not yet finished, something that waits to be forged anew. Long after the solstice had passed and the lights of the cities returned to their shallow glow, the world remained altered in ways too subtle to announce themselves, but too profound to ignore. The hum no longer roared beneath the earth, it whispered. Metal had grown strange flexible in some places, brittle in others, as though memory had replaced structure. Bridges sang faintly when walked upon. Nails in old timber homes throbbed like heartbeats. Even the rails of long-dead train lines quivered under invisible pressure. People spoke of phantom forges heard at night, of glowing figures glimpsed in the fog where old factories once stood, their silhouettes bending and hammering in silence. In the archives of London, Clara Muir's notebook reappeared months after her disappearance, left neatly atop a librarian's desk, though the entire building had been sealed for renovation. The pages were blank, except for one new entry written in ink, the color of rust, its finished shaping. Now it waits to cool. No one could identify the handwriting. The paper itself was warm to touch, and under ultraviolet light faint patterns appeared 12 concentric circles forming a spiral that led inward to an unbroken center. When scanned, the image emitted a low vibration that caused the machine to overheat and fail. The notebook was locked away, but those who handled it claimed to hear the echo of hammering long after they left the room. Elsewhere, reports surfaced of magnetic anomalies spreading across the northern hemisphere. Compasses spun aimlessly, power lines thrummed with residual current, and beneath certain lakes, bubbles of metallic gas rose to the surface, reflecting red against the moonlight. The readings followed a pattern, the same 12-beat rhythm recorded before the solstice, but now slower, deeper, like the dying breaths of something immense cooling after creation. Geologists were baffled. Theologians called it revelation. In a monastery near the Scottish border, monks recorded Gregorian chants that began aligning with the hum, even when sung a cappella, their voices bending unconsciously toward its frequency until the sound grew hauntingly perfect. They said it felt as though the earth were singing with them, its tone vibrating through their bones. One monk, Brother Anselm, claimed that during prayer he saw the shape of the hammer not as a tool, but as a symbol, a point, where intention met consequence, where every strike echoed backward through time. He died 2 days later, his body found kneeling before the altar, his hands fused together in the shape of an anvil. Governments, terrified of public panic, buried all evidence. They shut down factories, citing economic reform. But the true reason was simpler. The machinery had begun to move on its own. In several plants, turbines spun without power, belts turned without engines, and molten metal appeared in crucibles that had not been lit for years. Cameras caught brief flares of light shaped like silhouettes, each repeating the same 12 motions before vanishing. Engineers dismantled the equipment, but when they attempted to melt down the parts, the steel refused to liquefy, only hummed. Some scientists suggested the world's magnetic field had shifted, imprinting atomic structure with harmonic memory, but others whispered that humanity had accidentally forged something alive. Among those few who knew the truth, the phrase "the 12th hammer" became both prayer and curse. They believed the world itself was the anvil, and that something ancient, buried beneath our progress, had used our industry to reawaken. As spring approached, a new sound emerged, not the hum, not the bell-like resonance, but the soft hiss of steam rising where there should be none. Across the moors and coastlines, fissures reopened, this time exhaling mist that carried flecks of glowing dust. Birds avoided these areas. Their feathers smoked when they passed through. Farmers reported their plows heating in their hands until the wood handles charred. Beneath the soil, faint lights pulsed, no longer red. Satellite scans revealed immense circular patterns forming across the northern hemisphere, interconnected by faint magnetic filaments. Each circle measured exactly 12 miles in diameter, each aligned with the others like gears in an invisible machine. The discovery was kept secret, but rumors leaked. The planet's crust was moving, not through tectonic drift, but by deliberate rhythm. The hammer had not stopped. It had only paused between strikes. Then, in early April, the dreams began. Millions reported the same vision: a furnace stretching beyond sight, an anvil the size of a mountain, and a single hammer suspended in mid-air, waiting. The air in these dreams shimmered with heat, and voices whispered in unison. "You are the ore." Psychologists called it mass hysteria. Yet those who experienced it, in one recorded case, a child in Oslo described seeing the hammer fall not once, but endlessly, each impact sending waves through time that forged new realities. She drew the pattern in crayon, 12 concentric rings intersected by a single vertical line. When compared to seismic data from the previous decade, the drawing matched perfectly. As word spread, more people began to hear the rhythm, not in their dreams, but in waking life, the distant clang of iron on stone reverberating beneath the world's noise. Radios caught fragments of it. Earthquakes began occurring in 12-second intervals. It was no longer an echo of the past, it was a countdown. The final signal came on a night when the northern lights bled red across the sky. Power grids collapsed in waves. Satellites failed. The global magnetic field shifted by a fraction of a degree. In the dark, every piece of iron rails, keys, nails, jewelry vibrated in unison. A single note so deep it rattled the marrow of those awake to hear it. For 12 minutes, the world glowed faintly from within, as if molten light had filled its core. Then, without warning, all motion ceased. The the hum vanished. Clocks resumed, birds sang, the air cooled. Scientists declared it a geomagnetic storm. But in the silence afterward, no one could shake the sense that something had completed. The forge beneath creation had cooled, the 12th hammer had fallen. Yet, in that stillness, a deeper understanding spread quietly, like heat lingering after a flame. The hammer was never meant to destroy it, was meant to shape. The world itself had been struck, refined, tempered, and those who listened closely enough could feel the echo within their own hearts. Each beat a faint remembrance of the forge that had made them in the months that followed. Strange discoveries surfaced, ancient artifacts unearthed from ice and desert alike, all made from unknown alloys that resonated faintly at the same 12-beat frequency. One archaeologist noted that when the artifacts were placed near iron, they emitted warmth and sound as though recognizing kin. He wrote that they were not remnants of the past, but blueprints of the future objects waiting to be reforged when the cycle began anew. Before his findings could be published, his lab burned down without fire. Every instrument melted into a single smooth sphere, cool to the touch, yet vibrating faintly, like a sleeping heart. It was sent to a classified facility, where it remains sealed in glass, humming every night at precisely 3:33. And now, when the air is still and the cities sleep, there are those who swear they can hear it, the faint sound of hammer on anvil echoing beneath their feet, slow, patient, eternal. It is not threatening anymore, but watchful, like a craftsman inspecting his work. Some claim that if you listen long enough, you'll feel warmth in your chest, as though something inside you answers the rhythm. The furnace waits not in the ground, but in us, cooling, remembering, dreaming of the next spark. For though the 12th hammer has fallen, its echo will never fade, and one day, when the world grows cold again, the forge will stir, the hum will rise, and creation itself will tremble for the next blow that shapes its story. Beneath the quiet surface of the world, where silence hums heavier than sound and time folds back upon itself, Chapter 10 begins, not with an explosion, but with a breath, a long, trembling exhale that ripples through the foundations of everything built upon the memory of fire. In the aftermath of the 12th hammer's fall, the world seemed ordinary again. Clocks ticked, power hummed, the seas calmed. But beneath the illusion of calm, the rhythm still lingered. It pulsed faintly through concrete, through veins, through dreams. No one spoke of it openly anymore, but in dim laboratories and forgotten monasteries, there were those who still listened. They called themselves the keepers of the heat, though no one remembered who named them first. Their purpose was not to worship the forge that once stirred the earth, but to monitor its remnants, to measure the quiet, to catalog the absence. Yet, slowly, they began to suspect that what they were recording was not decay but gestation, because the hum, faint as it was, had changed. It now rose and fell, like breath-like, something asleep but alive, something recovering its strength. One of the keepers, an old metallurgist named Dr. Henning Vale, noticed that when he whispered near the instruments, the hum responded in pitch, almost as if acknowledging language. He began speaking to it daily, reading aloud from his journals, from poems, from the histories of vanished civilizations. He claimed it remembered those words. When asked how he could know, he said simply, "Because I dreamed them before I spoke them." The others laughed at first, until they began to dream too. The dreams came as heat, as visions of a lightless furnace whose flames cast no shadow, where molten rivers flowed not downward but upward into an unseen sky. In those dreams, shapes moved within the gloam, the human nor divine, but forged, and each shape carried a hammer, smaller than the one that fell, glowing with newborn color. They worked in silence, striking invisible metal, their movements deliberate, unhurried, infinite. When the dreamers woke, they found their palms warm, faintly trembling, as though something inside them had echoed the motion. Across the world, reports surfaced of spontaneous heat blooms, cold metal turning warm without fire, sand fusing into glass beneath moonlight, coins bending in pockets as if softened by unseen flame. Scientists dismissed these as electromagnetic disturbances. Yet deep down, humanity recognized the truth it could never admit. The forge had not ended. It had retreated inward. The earth, newly tempered, had become the crucible for something else. Perhaps not a weapon, perhaps a seed. And in the heart of an abandoned factory somewhere in northern Europe, where the last functioning anvil still stood beneath layers of dust, a single hammer, small, unremarkable, and untouched by time, began to vibrate softly, keeping time with the quiet heartbeat of the world, waiting for the next hand bold enough to lift it. Within the last whisper of heat, within the dying breath of metal that once dreamed of gods, the factory, that hollow cathedral of rust and silence, stood alone beneath the bruised sky as rain fell in slow, deliberate drops that hissed into steam upon touching the still warm earth. Inside, the hammer no longer moved, yet the air trembled as if the echo of its rhythm refused to fade. For hours, perhaps days, the world outside seemed to hesitate, as though listening for instruction. The keepers were gone, their notes scattered, their instruments quiet. Dr. Vale's body had long since cooled, but the faint imprint of his hand remained burned into the anvil, a perfect silhouette that neither rust nor rain could erase. It was said that at the exact hour of his death, somewhere far from that northern ruin, the clocks of an entire city stopped for 13 seconds. No gears jammed, no power failed. They simply waited, suspended in a silence deeper than night. And when they resumed, nothing appeared changed, yet everything was. The forge's hum, so faint it could have been a memory, no longer came from the ground or the air. It came from within. Within machines, within hearts, within the quiet moments between waking and sleep. People began to feel warmth where there should be none, beneath fingertips brushing cold metal, in the handles of doors long untouched, in the hush before thunder. The heat no longer sought a shape. It had found one. Humanity itself had become the vessel, the living continuation of the first spark. The forge had moved inward, into the blood, into thought, into the slow rhythm of creation that hides within the smallest axe writing, building, dreaming. Some would say that was its mercy, others its final curse. Because, though the fires never rose again to burn the sky, they began to burn quietly in the mind. 1,000 inventors dreamed of impossible alloys, 1,000 artists of living bronze, 1,000 madmen of machines that breathed. And though they did not know why, they worked to the same rhythm, the same old beat of hammer to anvil, the pulse of the world, remembering how to make itself anew. In time, the factory crumbled. Moss consumed its walls. Trees broke through the floor. Birds nested where sparks once flew. But deep beneath the roots, buried in the soil like a seed, the anvil still glowed faintly, untouched by decay. When storms passed overhead, it pulsed once for each flash of lightning, answering the sky with its quiet defiance. Generations would forget the legend. The valley would vanish from maps again, and the earth would reclaim its scars. Yet every so often, in some distant corner of the world, a blacksmith would pause mid-strike, certain he'd heard another hammer answering his own, faint and far away, as if the metal itself were remembering the language of fire. They would look up, startled, heart pounding, unsure whether to feel dread or wonder, because what was forged once can be forged again. The hand that shapes never dies. It only changes form. So ends the story of the blacksmiths and their god of iron, the tale of men who dreamed too close to the flame, and of the fire that dreamed back. The forge sleeps now, but not forever. One day, when the world grows cold enough to forget its own name, the heartbeat will quicken again, the hammer will rise, and somewhere, in a place both ancient and new, beneath a sky the color of molten steel, the first sound the earth will hear will be that same patient rhythm, the one that began before history, before language, before fear itself. Hammer to anvil, creation remembering itself, the sound of the world being made once more.